So, just picking back up where we left off last class, and we were talking about how adolescents tended to underutilize healthcare systems. We talked a little bit about how, accidents and homicide and suicide were the leading causes of death in adolescence. So we talked quite a bit about that. And so here is a nice graph looking at males versus females in this sort of pubescent stage of adolescence, 12 to 17 years old. And you can see here, so we have a comparison of males versus females, and then we also have older males and females in emerging adulthood. Here males and here females. And here you can see unintentional injury is much greater in males versus females. We have homicide, suicide, and then other causes of death compared to girls. And then, of course, these values are much lower than emerging adulthood, where you see unintentional injury, which includes things like car accidents, and things like that, homicide, suicide, as well as other. And you can see this comparison of males versus females, much higher rates in males, which is what we kind of discussed last class. Now, when it comes to today's adolescents and what's going on, we know that nutrition is a huge aspect of health compromising and health enhancing behaviors. A lot of our adolescents today virtually live on things like fast food meals. We know that the eating habits of many adolescents tend to be health compromising, and we find an increasing number of adolescents having eating disorders and having disordered eating. We know that eating regular family meals during adolescence and early adolescence is linked to really much healthier eating habits 5 years later. Parents, of course, play an important role through this with the food decisions that they make. They serve as role models for healthy or unhealthy nutrition, as well as including adolescents in those regular family meals, and that contributes to, their well-being as they continue on. Schools, of course, also play an important role, and some say that there's a lot of problems with school meals and lunches. There is certainly a lot of concern in general with with American culture and the amount of fat in the diet, the amount of energy drinks that adolescents consume because they have a lot of really high caffeine levels, and there's been associations with drinking caffeine or consuming a lot of high caffeinated drinks, and how that is related to increased substance abuse as well as risk-taking behaviors. So that can, of course, be a concern. We know that exercise is really important because it improves the quality of life. There's a lot of really positive outcomes during adolescence with exercise. For example, has a positive effect on weight status. There's reduced triglyceride levels, so lower cholesterol, lower blood pressure, lower incidence of type 2 diabetes. Those individuals who engage in regular exercise tend to have lower levels of alcohol, cigarette, and marijuana use, as well as improved sleep quality, improved mood, and improved concentration as well. And so, it's really important to consider these positive outcomes. We also know that those adolescents who engage in exercise tend to have better connectivity between brain regions compared to adolescents who were less fit. We also see that exercise is a possible potential buffer against stress, and also improves mental health and life satisfaction, also improves cognitive skills. And we found a link between exercise and reduction of symptoms of attention deficit disorder. So there's some really interesting impact here. And then, of course, we do see some gender differences across the board. So here we see some ethnicity differences between non-Latino, white, African American, and Latino groups. Here you can see in all three categories, males tend to have higher rates of physical activity compared to their female counterparts. And then the highest level would be non-Latino white, whereas we see African American and Latino rates being very similar. There's a lot of factors that impact the likelihood of an adolescent engaging in exercise. For example, families is a really important one. Families play an important role in influencing adolescents' exercise patterns. There was a relatively recent study that came out looking at 9 to 13-year-olds, and those who were more likely to engage in physical activity during their free time were those who were more likely to feel safe, those who had places to be active, for example, parks and the Boys and Girls Club, and places to swim and run and ride their bikes. And they tended to also be more active when their parents participated in physical activities with them. So that was an important influencer on if the adolescent was actually going to engage in activity themselves. Now, peers also play a really important role because they influence the level of physical activity. And we haven't really dived into this as much yet, but peers during the adolescent developmental period tend to have even more of an impact on the adolescent than their parents. And so this is a period of time where their peer influence is really important. And we've found through studies that friend support for physical activity was actually a stronger predictor of adolescent physical activity when you compare it with support from parents or siblings. So peer influence is really, really important right now. And the presence of peers and friends actually influences the likelihood of adolescent boys, for example, and if they're going to be more likely to engage in physical activity. We also find that peer victimization has an influence. So, for example, if the person feels like they're going to be victimized by peers, they're going to be less likely to want to engage in physical activity, especially if they're overweight. So you can think to, playing dodgeball, playing team sports. And if the person feels like they're going to get bullied while playing that sport, they're going to be less likely to engage in physical activity. Schools also play a role in this, and a lot of people blame poor physical condition of U.S. children and adolescents, and place that blame on U.S. schools. And there is some evidence to suggest that, kids aren't participating in PE programs. And so looking back in 2013, only about 29% of U.S. 9th through 12th graders participated in physical education classes all 5 days in an average school week. Males were more likely to participate than females, so about 35% of males versus 24% of females. 9th graders tended to be more likely to regularly take a PE class, and it's about 42%, whereas the least likely to take a PE class is, you guessed it, the 12th graders, and only about 20% of those, so about 20% of 12th graders were really participating in PE classes. And then there are other studies that have found really positive benefits for programs that are designed to improve physical fitness in students. Obviously, there's a lot of benefit there. Another interesting factor, which is pretty you can pretty much guess, is that screen-based activity had a major impact on likelihood of the person engaging in physical activity. And so any screen-based activity would be like watching TV, using a computer, talking on the phone, texting, instant messaging, and doing this for like hours, long periods of time. This is definitely associated with lower levels of physical activity. And so there have been studies that have examined children and adolescents who engage in daily screen-based activity, and those who engaged in high amounts were much less likely to exercise daily. Those who engaged in low physical activity and high screen-based activity tended to be more overweight. They also had sleep problems, were more depressed, and had higher stress levels. And those indicate sedentary behavior. So if you're on your computer, if you're texting, you're less likely to be actually out physical and being active. Sports also play a role, and so there's some positive as well as potential negative. So a positive influence would be, for example, that the sports activities can improve physical health. It can improve well-being, self-confidence, motivation to excel, as well as ability to work with others. Whereas there are some negative effects, but some more positive effects would be that those adolescents who participated in sports tended to be less likely to engage in risk-taking behaviors. For example, truancy, not showing up to school, cigarette smoking, sexual intercourse, delinquency. And so there's some good positive benefits to sports, but of course we have to talk about the negative as well. And that's a lot of pressure. So pressure to achieve and win. They could have physical injuries. There's distraction from academic work, as well as unrealistic expectations for success as an athlete. Also, student athletes tend to get a lot of pressure from parents and coaches to win. They can get competition anxiety. We also see in some more extreme cases that they use performance enhancing drugs like steroids, which can impact their body and health and also change them physically. And so we also find another thing where we can see a trend called the female athlete triad. And what that is disordered eating, absence of their period, and osteoporosis. And these can impact the health not only of the female adolescent during that period of time, but also have problems in the future for their health. So another important factor to talk about is sleep, and you guys know that that's my area of expertise, so we're definitely going to spend some time talking about this. There's an article that I have you guys read that talks about delayed start times, school start times, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But there has been a pretty big increase in interest in looking at sleep during in adolescence, and that's because there has been more public interest in sleep and then how it affects children in adolescence. There was a survey that was conducted in 2006, and the National Sleep Foundation does this survey pretty regularly. So these values tend to be pretty consistent across the board, and that's about 45% of the adolescents got inadequate sleep on school nights. And what do we consider inadequate? Well, less than 8 hours. If you look the standard of how much sleep an adolescent should get, it's more than 8 hours. And there are individual differences in how much sleep an adolescent should obtain, but it is more than the adult level. And so adults should get about 7 or 8 hours of sleep, and adolescents should definitely get more than that. Those adolescents who got inadequate sleep on school nights were much more likely to feel tired or sleepy throughout the day, tended to be crankier and more irritable. They tended to be more likely to fall asleep in school, be depressed, and they tended to drink more caffeinated beverages compared to those who got optimal sleep. And of course, they're drinking the caffeine to counter affect that sleepiness. And we're also finding that there's research that's documenting the link between getting too little sleep and having problems during adolescence. For example, adolescents who got less than 7.7 hours of sleep per night on average tended to have more emotional and peer-related problems. They tended to have higher anxiety and higher levels of suicidal ideation. Adolescents who experienced unhealthy sleep tended to score lower on quizzes and be less attentive. And we know that sleep problems during adolescence are associated with things like lower level of working memory. Working memory is that type of memory that you are using when you're problem solving, when you're trying to remember things, when you're trying to actively study, you're using your working memory. And this is also related to things like greater risk taking. And so these all factor into why is it that adolescents are getting not enough sleep, right? So if you look at this graph here, okay, these are ninth graders, and about 40% of those students who got 8 hours of sleep or more on an average school night. So 40% of students here, of ninth graders, are getting 8 hours or more, compared to the worst group here, the 12th graders, who less than a quarter of these 12th graders are getting enough sleep. And so why? Why is it? Well, as you can imagine, social media, electronic media usage, caffeine, changes in the brain, as well as early school start times. Now, the changes in the brain, we know that the brain does not fully mature until you're 25. That's the frontal cortex. But an interesting thing happens during adolescence that we're just now starting to really understand, and that is that as a person goes through puberty, they experience a delayed phase. Whoops, we're going too fast here. Delayed phase. So a delayed sleep phase. And so what this means is that you don't get tired until later in the night. You still need to sleep 9 or 10 hours, but now you can't fall asleep until midnight. And so this delayed phase occurs during puberty, and you really kind of start growing out of it in adulthood. But what happens is that this means that you are not feeling tired until later in the evening. And so if you delay school start times, okay, the idea is that you can go to bed later, but you can sleep in, and then you can go to school. And there was a lot of argument here because the issue is that people were saying, well, if you delayed school start times 30 minutes, they're not going to get 30 minutes of sleep. They're just going to stay up later. And it turns out that was incorrect. They really did get 30 more minutes of sleep. And so a 30-minute delay in school start time was actually linked to improvements in adolescent sleep, alertness, mood, health, less behavioral problems. They weren't getting expelled or suspended or getting in trouble for, doing things that they shouldn't. And so the American Academy of Pediatrics recently advocated that schools should institute start times from 8:30 to 9:30 a.m. to improve students' academic performance and quality of life. And so we know that this works. And so one of the articles that I have you guys read talks about this and talks about the benefits of delaying school start times. It is really exciting in the field of sleep that the research is being conducted and that school systems are listening and they're actually trying to make the situation better for their students. We know that when the adolescents aren't getting enough sleep and, before this sort of delayed sleep time, we're seeing that they're consuming more caffeine. It's leading to, they're super sleepy throughout the day, and that's leading to lower academic achievement. We know that sleep patterns are poor in emerging adulthood, leading to worse physical and mental health. And, those patterns start in adolescence. And so they're going to be more likely to report emotional and academic stress, and that's going to negatively affect their sleep as well. So being able to kind of help with this by getting healthier sleep patterns while they're adolescents, adjusting for that delayed sleep phase, and allowing for them to get as much sleep as possible during this time period when there's so many other things going on. They're working, they're dealing with homework, and they're dealing with a lot of extra things. So I'm going to actually end the talk here, and then I'm going to pick back up on evolution just to kind of split these up just a little bit. And so we'll have one more video for the rest of the chapter 2 slides.